Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the eLearning Africa podcast. I'm Rob Vember. This podcast is brought to you by eLearning Africa, the Pan-African network for ICT for education, training and skills development, Africa's home for ideas, innovation and sustainable solutions for education, training and skills development since 2005. In this episode of the podcast, I'm in conversation with Mark West. I caught up with Mark ahead of his keynote address at the recently concluded eLearning Africa conference in Kigali, Rwanda.
What would it mean in terms of environmental impact to ensure that all 2 billion learners in the world have good, high-quality connected devices that are often obsolete after 2, 3, 4 years?
In our conversation, Mark provides a sobering assessment of how the world has fared with regards to education during the COVID-19 pandemic, describing it as a story of exclusion, heightened inequities, diminished learning, and diminished educational experiences. West acknowledges the need to look at how educational technologies can improve learning and efficiencies, but emphasizes the fundamental need for providers of education to look at how they can contribute to the holistic well-being of learners. Mark shares UNESCO's ideas on how to better center society's most marginalized, advocates for more online public spaces for public education, and emphasizes the need for creativity and pedagogical innovation about how to use the strengths of the digital space to improve teaching and learning. Mark West works in UNESCO's education sector, where he examines how technology can improve the quality, equity, and accessibility of learning. He currently leads work to operationalize the Rewired Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education. He's also authoring a UNESCO publication called An EdTech Tragedy, about lessons learned following the global shift from school-based education to technology-based education during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the world seems to some degree, get back to some sense of normalcy, and we kind of seem to have that urge, and in some degree fighting the urge to move along. What are you seeing in the space that you're working in, that you're researching? What are you seeing from the data? How quickly has education managed to bounce back, if it has, or is it lagging even further behind than what it was prior to the pandemic?
Thanks for the question, Rob. I think the short answer is not quickly enough. I mean, we see that education has often been sort of put on a back burner with this crisis. We saw that in many countries, school closures went on for a very long time. In some countries, 2 years and running. That's an incredible amount of time for schools to be shut down. We see schools as absolutely essential infrastructure. This is very important for the well-being of children, of young people, and of their family, of communities. And it's very unfortunate the duration of some of these closures. I think that, in some places we saw really heroic efforts to move to open schools as quickly as possible, to try to prioritize that. But, all too often, we also saw sort of a bit of a complacency where schools, remain shut for a long time. And in one of our upcoming publications, we speak to this sort of perception that technology could help fill the gap, may have led some places to keep schools longer, perhaps, than they should have been. For instance, we look back to some historical data, obviously a lot different with this current pandemic than the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish influenza. But during previous pandemics, schools were closed for much shorter durations of time, and in recognition of their importance as essential infrastructure and as a place of well-being for children and young people.
And that's an interesting point that you raise, and the first time I've heard that I've been in conversation with raise it in that way, and the point that we've kind of used technology as an excuse to justify schools remaining closed for as long as it has been closed. And I think what I'm hearing you say is where you're coming from in the work that you're doing would much rather that technology complement learning as opposed to it's not really designed to replace the model as it stands. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's a patch, right? I mean, we can, if you've got a hole in your pants or something, I mean, a patch is for some people it's good enough. I mean, it's a patch that didn't work for over half of the world too. I mean, that's another thing to keep in mind. It was a patch for some and no solution for many others. On the African continent, I mean, the exclusion from education when technology moved, or when education moved to technology was mind-boggling. I mean, huge numbers of people did not have any access to formal education when it became reliant on internet-connected technologies. But there was still that perception, if you will, that education was being taken care of. There were other options. Whereas when it comes to grocery stores, food things, I mean, those were, there. I think there were no other options, but the perception of a good enough solution maybe led to the prolongation of having a more permanent sort of solution. So yeah, I think it is an important observation, perhaps a controversial one. People may agree or disagree, but I think it's okay to raise this possibility that presenting technology as being a replacement for schools, the perception of this being a feasible solution maybe led to people sort of slowing down sort of emergency efforts to ensure schools reopened quickly.
So what is the paradigm from your perspective that we should ideally be looking at technology and education through? What is that ideal relationship? What is the balance? How do they work hand in glove?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's the $1,000,000 question is how do we balance this relationship? I think the experiences of the past 2 years of the pandemic have sort of shown that these visions, which were very much in circulation before the pandemic, that technology and digital spaces represented a sort of maybe a more modern or even more effective, more flexible, more agile kind of nexus for education. That this could be the sort of core, and that maybe schools would lose their dominant perch. I think there's been some rethinking around this and some soul searching about this, and that people suddenly saw schools as essential institutions that provide a lot more than academic and curricular learning. We live in societies that have really become, I think, a bit obsessed with signifiers of academic progress. How exactly are people doing in math and in reading, and we see country rankings and things like this. And COVID reminded us that education does a lot more than that, especially school-based education. These are places of socialization. These are places of acculturation. These are places where people learn to come into a community. They learn to deal with people from different backgrounds outside of the family. That there's so many different things that schools do. That we even observe that having children go to school is often a reason to ensure that communities are safe for children. That there are sidewalks and there are crosswalks, and that the world outside the home is a world that's safe and accommodating for young people and for children. So I think that's an important observation. I think a lot of people have recognized that, and I think that's a really important recognition that some of our discussions about education have become a little bit narrow about what we think education should do. And I think post-COVID, one of the really nice things that happens is people are taking a more enlarged view of education. We've certainly seen the word well-being circulating a lot more than that was not kind of a word that was central to the education discourse in 2018 or 2019. So, I think that's important. And now I think rightfully so, people are looking at how can educational technologies improve learning, add efficiencies? Absolutely, we need to do that. But also, how most fundamentally can they contribute to well-being? And that's a very important question. And that's certainly when we're thinking about at UNESCO, and I think the entire audience for eLearning Africa is also thinking about.
Without question, I think I see it on the continent here at home in Africa, in South Africa specifically, but also, there's stories from around the globe where we've specific to that question of well-being, where it's become so blatantly obvious, as you point out, for reasons of safety and security of the child, for reasons of literally, especially on this continent, where the only full meal the child gets for the day is at school. But we've also seen that in the UK. I'm a big, unashamed Manchester United fan for my sins. And Marcus Rashford, the English footballer, campaigning for the government to continuing to provide meals to kids at school, because school is so much more, as you rightfully say, than just the academic side of things. You had, in 2019, put a lot of work and produced a report on gender equity within the ed tech space, and particularly some of the pitfalls. And I was fascinated reading the introduction to that in particular, as to how you came up with the name. And I'm starting to pick up a bit of a pattern, and we'll get to your latest publication that's due out shortly. But I'd blush if I could. It certainly catches the eye. So 2019, you co-author I'd Blush If I Could, speaking to these gaps that exist in these blind spots. And then a year later, we're boom into a pandemic. How much harder has that task of gender equality become as a result, again, of the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. In 2019, yes, we observed these huge digital gender gaps that exist. We know that around the world, women and girls are far less likely to use technology for empowering purposes across the board, education in particular, but other purposes as well. Less likely to, no matter how you break it down, less likely to post on social media, less likely to be able to own technology, less likely to use any type of like mobile financial services. So kind of across the board, there are huge inequities in digital spaces and with regards to ownership and access to connectivities. Now, I'd Blush If I Could is a real look at why is that the case? Why is it that technology is often sort of gendered male, toys for boys and this kind of business? And we really unpack the reasons for that. And we think that a lot of them are educational, that there are a lot of sort of signals in education that this is something that's sort of male for men and boys and sort of not for women. And we certainly see that in the professional industries as well, where you look at the people who are studying computer science in higher education, overwhelmingly male. Then you get into, people actually working in professional jobs in computer science, again, even more overwhelmingly male. And so we trace some of the reasons for that, and then propose ideas for how education can help to create greater gender equity, in these spaces and companies and ideas that are really shaping our future in a profound way. And talk about the ways that, for instance, some countries that have made computer science courses obligatory, it's part of the core curriculum, that helps women and girls to maintain interest in the subject and sort of continue to follow through and pursue it. Whereas when it's optional, women and girls in a lot of countries will opt not to pursue that course out of this perception that it's so gendered. But now, yes, fast forward to the pandemic, and this immense reliance on technology just meant women, given these existing digital gender divides, women and girls were often on the outside. Families might have had one connected device. That device was often being used by dad or an older son or something like that. And during the pandemic, that meant missing out on education. It meant missing out on communication with friends and peers. I mean, that was, those devices were really a source of connection to the outside world, to other services. And so, yes, it introduced tremendous inequities. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were quite hopeful that, given the strong shift to digital technologies, it could be an opportunity to correct some of these digital gender divides, that people are sort of forced to begin using computers, download software, and develop more familiarity. But we're still looking for sort of strong evidence that happened. I'm sure it happened in isolated cases, but did it happen sort of across the board? That's harder to see signals of that.
It's another great point, and I think goes back to a point you made a few minutes ago regarding just the perceptions. We sit here kind of having come through this, knock on wood, come through this at this stage, April of 2022, feeling relatively okay that we've made it through a global pandemic, and the perception therefore is that many other people have made it through, and schools are getting back and things are starting to work again. And so for those reasons, there is that perception that, yeah, everyone was able to get hold of a computer, get hold of a mobile device, able to continue their schooling. And it is a rather privileged view to have, but perhaps, as you're suggesting, not accurate. Are you, from a UNESCO point of view, or just your experience and exposure to this kind of work, aware of any studies out in the field at the moment, of the various, looking specifically at this issue of just how much were people either able to keep up or not?
This is again one of those million-dollar questions. Is what we've been asking ourselves at UNESCO is, how can digital technologies, this sort of digital transformation that's on us, better support inclusion and equity? And that's a big question, because look, efficiencies, yes, I mean, we can talk about that, but what we have seen evidence of is this is just widening existing divides. You've got people who are already privileged becoming kind of more privileged with regards to, they've got devices, they've got connectivity, they then have access to different types of educational resources, and and great, excellent. But then you have all these people who are on the outside, and we've not seen sort of clear models of how that can help to ensure that there is greater inclusion and greater equity. Let me give you a concrete example. At UNESCO, we're often talking about the people who are out of school. That's about 275 million people before COVID. I mean, huge numbers of students still do not have access to schooling and to formal education. When COVID happened, that conversation largely went away. The idea was then to reach people who were already in schools with some sort of connectivity and devices, and to allow them to continue their learning. But those 275 million people, I mean, they were I was hopeless, lost. And so going forward, how can we use technology in creative and new ways to expand the number of people who are able to access education, to improve equity and not just drive divides further apart? A really sober and objective look at what happened during the sort of periods of school closure and intense reliance on technology, it was a case study in inequities just ballooning, growing. And so that's the question we need to ask ourselves. What are the models to ensure greater inclusion and greater equity? We see a lot of focus, and before the pandemic, on greater efficiencies, greater outcomes, and other things. But I think we can agree that this idea of inclusion and equity are of paramount importance, and they're right at the top of international goals for education. Put those as sort of principles above other principles. Something to think about as we go forward, and it's certainly something we're thinking about at UNESCO.
Is that then the foundation of an ed tech tragedy. Pretty much sounds like a bit of a tragedy based on what you've just, soberly outlined and necessary to do so. Certainly, what is the groundwork for an ed tech tragedy, and what should we be expecting to read?
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited about this work, and we know it's a somewhat of a, of a interesting proposition, the title, and maybe even a bit of a provocation. People will, agree or disagree, but the narrative that we have seen grow up around this sort of pandemic is education catapulted into the future, education leapfrogged, education, thank goodness we're finally moving away from this industrial model of schooling, and education is sort of unshackled at last. And that's not our reading. Our reading is this was a story of, again, exclusion, heightened inequities, diminished learning, diminished educational experiences narrowing. Don't get me wrong, we're excited about the potentials of technology, but the particular models that were applied during COVID tended to benefit people who were already privileged in other ways and put people who were at disadvantages at even greater disadvantages, and subjected them to even greater exclusion. So that's what to sort of expect. I mean, an EdTech tragedy tells this world-spanning story of, what happened. And on one hand, I mean, it's just so interesting. For so long, people had been talking about, education can sort of support or technology can support the full weight of education. And then due to this, global health emergency, suddenly that became a reality. And, what occurred? And our book just breaks down, what happened in different places, and how was this experienced by teachers, by learners? How did relationships between teachers and students, between peers and classmates change as a result of this experience? Super fascinating in my view, and I think it really helps us understand how to position educational technologies a little bit differently and a little bit better, so that they are really allies of kind of a more human-centered educational experience. We also observe in the book, the enormous reliance on private providers, and often for-profit companies. I mean, a lot of people's experience of education moving to technology platforms was education moving into things like Google Classroom, where you needed to establish a Google account. And then suddenly teachers were trying to figure out how to use all sorts of Google applications to provide education. Is that progress? We can agree or disagree, but that is an enormous reliance on, on companies that are not, they're outside of public control. There wasn't any sort of public discussion about these decisions that were taken. And, I think that ideally, we're looking for education systems that serve a common and collective good. And, UNESCO has been really adamant that education is a human right. It doesn't exist in a sort of commercial logic of profit and, that type of world. It's something that is a right and serves a public as well as individual goods. And we saw during the pandemic, it was sort of education for me, instead of this sort of ethic of education for us. And we hope that going forward, digital technologies can, of course, support an education for me, that's important, but also can support this idea of an education for us, and an education that advances public and collective goods.
What was the kind of geographical scope of the book? I mean, you pretty much covered every corner of the globe, so to speak, and picked up patterns and similarities across in terms of that inequality.
Absolutely, it's global in scope, and this is where it gets, so interesting. Our kind of moment, our digital moment, if you will. You had kind of two situations. In rich and developed countries, you had this sort of full technology saturation. Family concerns were that their children were spending too much time on digital devices. We had seen initiatives in some countries, Korea is one example, where governments were trying to shift more teaching and learning into online spaces and digital textbooks and other things. And there was community and family resistance because it was like, school is the one place where my kid is not just staring at a screen, in a corner individually. We like this idea that there's a sort of prolonged break from, immersion into these digital spaces and experience. So that's on, one side, rich developed countries. But then you've got your developing countries where there's huge numbers of people with no access to technology at all. And clearly that's disempowering, and so, there, the sort of narrative was, my gosh, that we knew about the digital divide before, but COVID just made it so apparent. All of these people are just missing out on education. There's no way for them to access educational materials. Yes, maybe the government put some, educational learning materials on a URL someplace, but nobody's able to access it. The devices are too expensive. The connectivity plans are, prohibitively expensive. So you have this sort of, these very different views. And we're seeing some quite concerning signs that in rich and developing countries, technology is now being positioned as a sort of solution for underprivileged people, that sort of automated learning and, log on to your device and access things, that'll be for, the underprivileged, whereas the very privileged schools will access in-person learning with teachers and sort of technology light. I always try to keep a sort of litmus test on, like, what are the most privileged people in societies doing? I sit in Paris, in France, rich country, rich city. We're in the 7th arrondissement in Paris. But the schools here, the richest, most expensive private schools, they market no technology at all. We do human experiences. We teach people socio-emotional skills. We'll teach your kids all the soft skills. The tech stuff, don't worry about that. That's going to come for sure. They got devices and tablets and computers at home. Yes, we'll kind of work with that a bit, but the space of the school, we're kind of putting that aside. Ironically, that's even true in the heart of Silicon Valley. You look at where the kind of leaders and shakers of your tech, big tech companies go to. Their kids are not going to technology first schools. They're going to schools that are very sort of human focused. It's expensive. It requires resources and other things. But we observe that education is at core. It's about human development, right? It's very odd then that there's so many voices saying, let's remove the humans from this process and sort of automate it and AI driven and all of this other stuff. And so this book observes through the lens of the experiences of the pandemic, how can we get back into a more sort of human-centered approach to education? And I think that we're seeing some of the costs of this obsession with sort of digital spaces. It's, we know from the experiences of the past decade, certainly the past 5 years, that, these digital spaces can be sort of echo chambers of polarization. And there's some concerning signs about the publication observes are digital spaces as they're conceived right now sort of appropriate spaces for public education. We further observed that, you want to look at big initiatives. We just had some meetings at UNESCO. We were talking about where are the public democratically controlled spaces online. You come to Wikipedia, that was 20 years old, but it's really hard to find other examples. Most of the other examples are profit driven. They need eyeballs, they need advertising. Public education is at a remove from that. And when you move public education into these digital environments, those become sort of greater risks and stepped up.
Again, great that you point that out, and that so that we are forced to see just how that global reset, in one sense, where the rich and famous and wealthy and those who are buying the means and are steering their kids away from the tech, whilst others are being pushed towards it. So you ring those alarm bells, and I'm really grateful that you do. And you're certainly not the first in terms of this podcast. I think of Barbara Mercer from a few months back, who also spoke about this human-centered approach to how we do education. And I know that you're working on, I don't know whether this is actively still working on, you'll tell me in a second, or completed the Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education. Does that tie into some of the solutions, trying to pull everyone together to steer in the same direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of our upcoming publication, An EdTech Tragedy. I mean, this is sort of the why we need new directions for the digital transformation of education. We observe that we're on a bit of a troubling trajectory, greater exclusion, heightened inequality. This is not necessarily the direction we want to continue careening down. So the Global Declaration is our sort of best ideas about how to reorient the digital transformation of education. And it's very simple, actually, and we work to kind of hard to just ensure that the kind of main ideas come through. First idea is, how can we better center the most marginalized? We see lots of ed tech initiatives that target kind of people who are already privileged. You know, they've already got devices, they've already got good connectivity. You know, those are the people kind of in the crosshairs of a lot of initiatives. What about the person that doesn't speak the language of instruction? What about the student that's not necessarily in school right now? You know, what about refugees? What about women and girls that don't necessarily have access to technology? How can ed tech initiatives center those people? That's the first principle. The second principle just observes, look, we have public education, and it's compulsory, and it's supposed to be free. So where are the public spaces for public education on the internet? Where are the free spaces for public education on the internet with great world-class content and other things? We were really struck during the pandemic that, even families that had great connectivity, great devices, they were set up. They didn't actually really know where to go all the time to help follow, say, fourth grade math or seventh grade reading. It wasn't clear where to go. It was this sort of hodgepodge of one app here and another app there, often requiring a subscription or a login, and offered by a third-party provider, and it's free for this, but if you want to upgrade and get access to more content, you can pay $5.99 a month. In our view, there should be a clear place for people to go to access public education on the internet. So it's about sort of content and platforms and other things. And then the final principle is around the pedagogy itself. We saw that classroom pedagogies were kind of replicated, or this big rush to sort of replicate what had been happening in classrooms and digital spaces. Hence the explosion of meetings in Zoom and in Teams. And it's not to say that doesn't have a place. It very well may, but it's also just to observe that the digital space is very different than the physical space. And it'd be really exciting to see some more creativity in how pedagogical innovation about how to use the strengths of the digital space to kind of improve teaching and learning, and also to advance this more holistic view of what education is and can be, where it includes things like well-being. It includes things about socialization, coming into a group of peers, and these other things that happen in a physical space of school, so that it doesn't just sort of narrow to purely academic, curricular driven learning. So that's the declaration, and it really is our sort of response to how to reorient this digital transformation, which we're very much in. I mean, it's in process, and we observe that the time is right now, because the paradigms that have grown up, they're still malleable. I mean, they're solidifying to some extent, but there's no rule book that says the only way you can access education is through an app with a credit card in iTunes or something. There are different possibilities. We saw a lot of those possibilities in the 90s and other things, more kind of community projects around web products and content and other things. So how can we make these digital spaces more conducive for teaching and learning and the sort of human-centered education? we hope to see for everybody.
And so you speak of education in the sense of it being a public good. I think we can all hopefully agree that it is. Are we finding the right partners? Are we looking in the right places to make sure that a global compact like the one you're talking about works?
I don't know. I don't know if we're looking in the, in all of the right places. We observe in the book that a lot of times the sort of impulse to apply technology to a problem often goes under the banner of technological solutionism. This idea like we've got a problem, how can an app help us fix this? Kind of reaching for that tool first has a way of distorting what the problem is you're trying to solve. And so I think that going forward, it's helpful to continue to think about technology not as this being so sort of this central pillar in everything. It's a tool among many other tools. And what tools do we want to apply to these to these problems? We've got close to 300 million students out of school. Yeah, technology is there, it's a tool. What role can it play? But what role can other things play? You mentioned nutrition at the beginning. We've seen some really exciting things that by providing a nutritious hot meal at school, that can entice all sorts of people to come to school who might not otherwise be there. How can schools be better places of protection? That a lot of people not sending their kids to schools because they perceive that the schools are not necessarily safe or difficult to get to schools. That's a different scenario. I'm not sure technology is the right thing to throw at that problem. So I hope that kind of going forward, we're a little more humble in our recognition that when we look at a problem through the lens of technology, we often kind of distort, narrow what that problem is, and to keep a sort of expansive view of what that problem might be. In the book, we observed that, for instance, talking about technological solutionism, first you had a problem of schools are closed because of a health crisis. Okay. Amazingly, sort of uniformly, the solution to that problem was, let's shift all teaching and learning to, digital internet connected technologies mainly. And we'll also provide some TV and radio in case, people miss that. But that was the sort of solution. We've got a problem, technology can, bang, can solve it. But even when schools began to reopen, then there was this problem of, people had missed learning, or this sort of notion of learning loss, that people were out of school for, 18 months, sometimes 10 months. Our look is that schooling was disrupted on average globally for 10 months for an average, a typical student. Half of that for full school closures, but the other half for partial school closures. So, tremendous disruption. And students were not making the same learning progress that you would have expected at school. So then there's this kind of notion of learning loss. We need to accelerate. And guess what the solution is to that problem? More technology. Let's, we got apps, we got digital tutoring, we've got all this stuff. I mean, so it is, I think, useful to observe that, the problem changed, but technology was still the solution. It's a tool in a repertoire of other tools, and I'm not sure, it's necessarily or always the best tool. Don't get us wrong. It's a powerful tool. It's an important tool. It's hard to imagine life without an internet connected device. It's, but I think it's also okay to observe how it can lead to a distortion of problems, and how it can sort of narrow our creativity.
So as we wrap up here, let's look to Africa and the eLearning Africa conference in Rwanda, and I'm looking forward to hearing you engage there with a lot of these thoughts that you've shared with the crowd there. What is the kind of main thesis of what you're hoping to bring across, and or what you're hoping to receive?
I think the main thesis is to, on one hand, to help people kind of re-see the experiences of the pandemic. I think there's a lot of like knee-jerk reactions to, especially in the kind of ed tech community, that education advanced, accelerated, leapfrogged, you know, we're providing a different perspective. There are grains of truth to that narrative, absolutely, but there are also, I think, grains of truth to a narrative that this was a denigration of the status quo, and important lessons, to be learned from those experiences. So that's kind of one thing that I hope people will kind of take away from some of our engagement at eLearning Africa. The second thing to take away is, okay, if that's the case, what do we do going forward? And that's where I think we have some really concrete ideas. A lot of those ideas are captured in our Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education, and these different principles and commitments that we propose. And so then helping people think through, how can these be implemented, these commitments and principles. What does it mean to center the most marginalized with a digital learning initiative? you know let's really think through, a lot of the content that you see online for education. It's developed pretty quickly. It's behavioralist. It's a list of flashcards. It's frankly not too exciting. I mean, what are the examples of, really rich and cool, digital learning content that can, provide different learning experiences and possibilities? And how can that be woven into a sort of, school-based experience? Going forward, we hope that there's, take advantage of the best of both situations. You've got these amazing digital tools on one hand. You've got this incredible infrastructure of school that's been built up over, centuries in places. And we also hope that it serves as a bit of a red flag that, this infrastructure of schooling that has, it's an incredible undertaking when you really step back and think about it. Universal schooling. There's, no matter what continent you're in anymore. I mean, there are schools, there are teachers, there are buildings, there are desks, there are learning resources. That has been a huge undertaking. And let's not just throw that out because we have a notion that, digital technologies might do this better. Let's recognize that these places are important, even sacrosanct, and then let's figure out how they can sort of be supplemented with these powerful new technologies as we realize sort of new educational paradigms and experiences going forward. So I hope those are some lessons that we're able to draw, but we'll do our best to kind of package these in very clear form for the audience at the conference.
Appropriately accompanied by the sirens of Paris behind you as you sound those alarm bells. And physically behind you, not that anyone can see this, is that a rhinoceros?
Yeah, actually, this is a gift that was given to me by some educational friends and colleagues in Nigeria. Actually, I was in Nsukka a few years ago, so yeah, it's really fantastic. Yeah, and that's a book cover of Reading in the Mobile Era, which we really observed how, mobile technologies can improve access to, books and stories that can be educational. And, we observed how many places in the world a barrier to literacy is the lack of books. And that,
Yeah.
This digital revolution may help finally ensure that at least this technical barrier to literacy, not enough text, not enough books, will be overcome, and that can be a real boon to literacy. So I hope that people don't walk away thinking we're anti-tech or something. We're not at all. But I think it's okay to, we look at the evidence, and that's what an edtech tragedy is about. And we didn't come at this thesis, we didn't come at this work with the thesis of tragedy. That came after months and months of sort of observing the data. And I remember with the small group kind of working on this, we said, it's like a literary tragedy. in the real literary sense, because that wasn't the outcome people wanted. People in this, I mean, us included, people who work in ed tech and the eLearning Africa crowd, and these are people we all know each other. I mean, we wanted a better outcome, a fairer outcome. I mean, and people worked like dogs to to help ensure a better outcome. And would it have been worse with no technology at all? That's book doesn't really go there. I mean, maybe indeed having some life rafts is maybe better than having none, but it's still okay to observe those enormous gaps and holes that existed. And it's through that reading that we kind of came to this notion of tragedy in that in that literary sense. It was a reversal of intention. We wanted to preserve education and to ensure that it remained inclusive and equitable and of high quality. And that goal, I think we can all sort of humbly agree, was not necessarily achieved. And there are certainly lessons to be derived from it. And that's ultimately what a tragedy is. It's about lessons to be learned. And that's what we hope people will take away from the new work that we're publishing, and also take away from our engagement at eLearning Africa.
Many thanks to Mark for his time and for sharing so freely his insights at this year's eLearning Africa conference. Be sure to follow eLearning Africa on our social media platforms to see all the images and highlights from what was a bustling Kigali Convention Center. If you weren't able to make it to Rwanda this year, we hope to see you in 2023 for another installment of Africa's premier ICT for education gathering. Thanks to you for listening. If you've enjoyed our time together, please rate and subscribe to the podcast and share it widely. And of course, don't forget to visit elearning-africa.com.